I got my
We'll see.
got my peak. I got my EQ. I got
Check,
my
check,
volume,
check,
I got my
check.
denoise. All right. You just did your checks. Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to
I
not
was
make
gonna
it
say,
like the
do you
last
need
time
to do
I
the
was the one.
la
that
la la la
started.
la.
Yeah, all right.
Me.
Welcome back to Exit 181, the podcast where. Damn it.
Yeah, boy!
Oh, smile.
Okay, here we go. You ready? Silence!
Welcome back to Exit 181, the podcast where Matt Duncan, that's him,
And Dean Bianchi.
that's me, talk music and stuff. See, this is where I don't know. I'm trying not to say the same thing that we always say.
Talk music and stuff. Like that could be our byline. Matt and Dean
Music
talk
and
music
stuff.
and ... stuff.
That
Period.
works. I think we just go with this. I mean, it's enough of an intro. I mean,
Okay.
we're literally
All right.
just
So
rambling.
right.
So.
Yeah. This week we're going to talk about something that I happened to notice and was thinking about. A lot of the soundtracks that I remember during high school from like John Hughes movies and that sort of thing had a lot of interesting alternative college rock tunes on them. And then when, I don't know, maybe 1994, well, really what strikes me most is the Crow soundtrack had a bunch of sort of harder edged alt rock stuff on it. And then you get the things like Spawn and Escape from LA and some of the other soundtracks
like
of
the Saint, didn't they have some?
yeah, that had a
stuff
pretty good one. Yeah, and that was really a trend for a while, you know, especially as the media conglomerates sort of coalesced and ate each other and became, you know, bigger and bigger mega companies with all these subsidiaries that used to be independent. We'd see these interesting sort of mixtapes effectively. Like I bought a bunch of soundtracks just because they had a bunch of songs by bands I liked, and I liked the songs that happened to be on there. The soundtrack to Russian vampires fighting, like Night Watch had a really interesting soundtrack. That you should, if you're at all interested in text on the screen and more kind of almost comic book inspired subtitles, Night Watch is an amazing thing. Like at the beginning, there's a kid,
Chemical Brothers, and there's an REM song.
The Bravery, I think, has a tune that ended up at least at the end of the film. I don't know if it actually made it onto the soundtrack or not. That's another interesting thing. The songs that are in the movies that don't make it onto those mass marketed soundtracks. But so there's a bunch of that stuff happening. John Hughes in particular, you know, is basically giving you a mixtape every time he makes a movie. And through the 90s, we saw that. And then sometime in the early aughts, mid-aughts, somewhere in there, by 2010, I don't notice it as much anymore. I don't see soundtracks being pushed and being so heavily pop music influenced. Jonathan Davis from Korn put together the soundtrack for Queen of the Damned. And that's actually a really pretty cool soundtrack. It's got a bunch of like new metal-y stuff, but it's also got a bunch of collaborations. He wrote most of the songs on it and then got like Chester from Linkin Park to sing with them, and Static X is on there. There's some interesting stuff on all these soundtracks, and then it just, to me, seems like it kind of disappears and dries up.
Well, I wonder, I guess not to interrupt, like I'm trying to think, like a little bit of it might be the genre of music that's landing on soundtracks isn't in our wheelhouse. Because I'm thinking, you know, so when my daughter was young, and then soundtracks were a lot of like, I'm trying to think, was it like Trolls or something? Like it's a lot of Justin Timberlake,
the Trolls.
And like there's a lot of songs that were really popular that were from soundtracks. But I think popular music, it's you know, in sync and. But
so Trolls
Justin
is a really good
Bieber
example. Because that's another one of those things where you've got somebody curating this thing and re-recording all these songs with the stars of the of the film singing them.
Okay.
They're like the versions of the songs on there are, it's a musical. Like that particular movie is a musical, so all those songs are diegetic. You know, they're actually part of the movie, not the background.
And maybe
music.
that's a bad example in the context of.
It's an interesting one
kids.
Though. Yeah,
but like kids stuff, because then you're like Frozen and like all these kind of like things. Like
musicals are sort of different, right? You know, like a musical where the music is part of it. That's still popular, and that's still something that I see. You know, like Frozen, for God's sake, that was bonkers. And they're still and then Pitch Perfect, like, but they redid all those songs.
Yeah.
You know, they re-recorded them, and that Pitch Perfect soundtrack is really cool, and I really like both of those movies actually for the way that they use the music in them. And you know, that's not a genre that I'm necessarily all that into, you know, in my daily life, but my kid liked it, and I liked what was happening. I could get a little meta about it and pay attention to why that music was being used that way. But I haven't seen or heard anything about a soundtrack that was like, look at all the, you know, the great tunes that are on this soundtrack. I don't see ads. Like, I watch a lot of YouTube and I leave the ads on. I don't have an ad blocker. And I see ads for movies all the time, and the soundtrack doesn't get mentioned. Maybe there's one song playing, but there's nothing about soundtrack available on RCA record. You know, none of that kind of stuff is happening in the way that it was huge in the 90s.
Yeah. Well, and because some of the ones you mentioned, I know I actually just saw something recently, I think on that, because Wax Tracks or one of those that I'm following on social media or whatever, like they were pointing out, I think it was like Thrill Kill called on the set of The Crow. Like the band was actually like,
because there's in the club, they're playing in the club.
And so
Ministry's on the AI soundtrack. The Ministry plays in the film AI.
But where I was going is, I wonder if, like, you know, especially maybe not even movies, but even like Netflix series and stuff like that. Like a lot of times there's some really great music, but it's music that's on somebody's album. Whereas I think the specifically like The Crow and like Spawn in that era, those bands it was either like B tracks that they didn't release, or they were writing a song for the movie. Whereas I feel like now a lot of these movies just are licensing, you know, a cool Radiohead song or something, like whatever, and using it. So even if the soundtrack comes out, it's more of just a compilation of stuff that already exists elsewhere. Whereas I think that window of time you're talking about, for sure, a lot of those songs, those aren't on those bands' albums.
So this is a good segue into a little bit of research I did today, because I was like, well, when did this start, you know? And so I looked through like Reddit and some other forums and just some articles I could find online, and it seems like, you know, around from the dawn of film making, you know, in the 20s, really, once there was sound, popular music would show up, but it would be like, there's the band, or it was, you know, because they would orchestrate these scores to films. And then by the time Disney was making Beach Blanket Bingo and stuff like with Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon, or you know, occasionally the Beach Boys would be in a movie, and you'd see the Beach Boys singing their song on the beach or something like that. And then this thing happened in the 60s where all of these biker movies started being made. And at first they'd hire some guy, and then one of the guys was named Davy Allen. And Davy Allen and the Arrows did the soundtracks to a ton of biker movies.
Okay.
And Davy Allen and the Arrows is like Davy Allen and a bunch of guys he hired to play the songs he wrote. And it was surf rock. And then they move away from the beach as the setting for these Hell's Angels, you know, whatever, kind of Easy Rider-ish kind of movies. And they move to the desert, so the music changes tone away from beach rock, surf rock to these other things. But basically they're like hiring one or two guys, then they pick a couple of other tunes to throw in there. And then you get to Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate. And when they hire Simon and Garfunkel to do all the songs, that's an actual pop band doing that stuff. And it's not long after that you get to George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola and Scorsese and all those cats who were kind of like buddies and around the same age, Spielberg, who start making movies where they start putting their favorite songs in the movies as opposed to only having a score. It's now there's a score and a soundtrack, and the soundtrack is popular music because they're working against that grain of you can only have film score music to score your film. You can actually use pop music to do these things. So that gets you into the 70s, right? And then it's, 10, 15 years later that Hughes just starts pulling. Now he starts pulling a little bit of both of the things we've already mentioned, where he'll tell somebody, hey, I need 2 songs. But he'll also pull stuff off of somebody else's, B-side or some track. But like, I heard a story where that If You Leave by, gosh, what's the name of that band?
Is that Simple Minds?
No,
it's OMD? No.
OMD, yes.
Is
okay,
it
that
OMD?
OMD tune. I heard that they had like a day and a half or something to write and record that song because he needed a different tone for the ending of the film because of some way that it didn't track with a test audience or something. I don't know the whole of the story, but the idea there is like he commissioned that song and they wrote it pretty quickly. And I think there's an episode of Professor of Rock on YouTube that goes into the details of the writing of that and recording of that song, and it's pretty interesting. That's a pretty interesting YouTube channel to check out if anybody's interested. But then you get to the stuff we were talking about, like you pointed out with The Crow, where some of the stuff on there is stuff that existed somewhere else, but a lot of it they commissioned for the film. And even the Spawn soundtrack has a few things like that, where like Marilyn Manson does a song with Sneaker Pimps. And it was a Marilyn Manson song that the Sneaker Pimps added some stuff to. And that was kind of commissioned for that soundtrack or whatever. It doesn't appear anywhere else. They weren't collaborating in any other way. They just kind of
Well, that whole I just pulled it up. Like that whole album is
it's weird cross genre stuff.
Yeah.
You
got
so it's
Filter and Crystal Method, Marilyn Manson, Sneaker Pips, Orbital, and Kirk Hammett.
That's a really cool one.
Yeah, they used that sample, Butthole Surfers sample.
The
Korn and the Dust Brothers, Butthole Surfers and Moby, Metallica and DJ Spooky, Stabbing Westward and Wink, Manson and 808 State, Prodigy, Tom Morello, Silverchair, Vitro, I don't know who that is, Henry Rollins and Goldie, Incubus, DJ Greyboy, Slayer and Atari Teenage Riot, and then Soul Coughing and Ronnie Size.
So that's kind of like that EDM.
Okay, so that was 97.
Yeah.
What was?
So that's almost
Well, when was
the one with the rap guys doing the songs
Just
with
Another
the
Victim and
Just Another
on there.
Right.
Judgment Night.
Yes.
Judgment
Yeah,
Night.
that's what I was gonna say.
I just want to see if that's.
That Spawn soundtrack is kind of like a spiritual successor or
so that was 93.
Almost.
Yeah, that's a few years later. That I'm just like side note that song came up earlier.
Just Another Victim?
Yeah, we were catching up with Grace came home from work and I forget what they were talking about and she said something, I'm just a victim, and I just said, yeah, you're just another victim. You're just another victim, kid. She didn't know what
and you're the only one who got it, right?
Right, of course, yeah.
Well, I would have laughed.
And then that always makes me think of, I have to shout out Phil, because then I always think of the 4-track. Do you remember when we made our own version of? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Just Another Sausage. I don't know.
It
exists on a cassette somewhere, and it's going to make no sense to anyone at all, but yeah.
It's all good. Well, in the video version, you can find that clip. Yeah. I might have the VHS with that.
You probably do. I know that I had it on audio cassette somewhere. Yeah, actually, this doesn't need to stay in, but yeah, I would love to. Whatever that thing I made for you probably has a few bits and pieces that are possibly lost to wherever. I mean, I might have a copy of some of that stuff, but
I've got that.
Because I know I
just have to dig
I have
it out.
Phil doing America on YouTube, so that's
Yeah. But yeah, that thing's got you and Scott doing those couple of music videos, and then the eggplant with lobster sauce, and all kinds of great stuff. Yeah,
which that exists. I think that's on Facebook somewhere.
Eggplant with lobster sauce is?
It's online somewhere, dude. And I always forget where I put it because it's been.
Oh man, I want to show that to my 8-year-old. It's hilarious.
Do you though?
Yeah. Oh, I do. I watched that so many times when I didn't have TV.
Yeah.
In the mid 90s, and I was living in North Carolina. I just throw that tape in and watch 6 hours of Dean curated goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's where we need a Patreon, and then we'll.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the bonus.
The platinum person will get a copy of the.
If you think we should start a Patreon where you can get all of these gems from the basement, you should comment on YouTube or Facebook and let us know.
Or Spotify or whatever, I think.
Yeah, wherever you go. Can you comment on Spotify?
Maybe not.
Okay, well, that's fine. Well, as long as we're interacting with people somewhere.
All right. Sorry to have derailed, but let's go.
No. It's fine. So I'm wondering, is partly the decline of CD physical media and the increase in digital media something, because I think a lot of this was,
it was a money making.
Yeah. This was Universal and whoever else owns these things to another way to get another revenue stream. And let's face it, for as much as CDs kind of revolutionized the way we consumed music, they were such a scam as far as the cost to produce. I mean, if you knew you were going to make, or if you were going to sell several, tens of thousands of these things, the cost to produce them just goes through the basement. It's just so low compared to like pressing records or recording tapes or whatever, just thinking about cassette tapes and the fact that there are screws in them, that there's, that you've got glue and mechanical pieces holding these pressed, formed, molded plastic things with spools of magnetic film. That was like an easy way to consume audio at some point. What the hell? And then you get a CD and it's just a piece of, it's a layered disc. It's a thin piece of plastic with some reflective stuff in it. And that is such a different production process. And as long as you're going to do a bunch of them, well, you're going to rake in mad cash.
Yeah.
And as soon as that starts to decline, well, why do it? It's not the money making thing. So I'm wondering too, like how many of these filmmakers were forced to say, put Kirk Hammett and Orbital on their soundtrack or whatever.
No, I mean, I think for sure it had to be a money making tool. I mean, when we're these movies we're talking about, like, I know I watched Judgment Night once, but I've listened to the soundtrack 30 times, and the same thing with Spawn I might have saw once. Crow I've probably seen maybe 2 or 3 times, but but for the most part it wasn't. I mean, at the same time, we owned way more CDs than we owned movies. I think DVDs, until DVDs really even came into, at some point in there, you're still in this sort of like a VHS tape costs $80 unless you rent,
Right.
So owning movies was still a little less common than, or you had a bootleg copy or somebody taped it off of something and whatever. But, it was the music was, you could go and get that for $15 or $20 or whatever.
Right.
I do think it's also probably, I don't know for sure, but, that's probably around the beginning of these big companies, like you were referencing it a little bit, they're buying these smaller record labels or the indie labels. A lot of them are really just subdivisions of bigger labels. And those bigger labels are also connected to movie companies that have sub movie companies that make smaller movies and bigger, like that's the beginning of this starting to have all those things sort of all be under these bigger giant umbrellas. So probably getting these artists, music together for a soundtrack is way easier than it probably was in the 80s. Like probably the John Hughes kind of reference stuff is a totally different process to get with those bands and figure out how that all worked. Like, and then even now, and then even thinking to now, like I think part of why you're not seeing, I definitely think for sure you're onto something with the, CDs aren't a thing. And all the things we've talked about in these other episodes about how you consume music. So it doesn't make sense. You're not trying to curate that 12 song thing of something to tie to a movie because no one's going to consume it that way. It's more about a single. But then also now those companies, like literally, actually we were commenting the other night, like on movies and stuff. When you start a movie, I think any movie that's come out in the last 5 years, you've got 2 minutes of a list of every production company that's doing it. Yeah, and they're all connected in some way. So
it's
like
7 or 10.
Yeah, and then they're all really just under some umbrella of either whatever Warner Brothers or whoever. Like it's like, so it's because I bet there was a lot more. It was probably harder to license music from different. I seem to recall like even like things where like. Well, like I know for TV for a long time when it first started coming to DVDs, and then it was like, well, this company doesn't have the rights to play the song that was owned by this other company.
Oh,
so they just take
really
it off the
hard.
DVD and they just do.
Yeah.
But now I don't know if it's as hard because there's literally they all kind of funnel up to one or two companies, and you kind of.
So this is a weird example, but what you're just talking about. So Dawson's Creek had that song by I Don't Want to Wait song by something Cole.
That's by either.
Her last name's Cole, Paula Cole. I Don't Want to Wait. So that was the opening theme to that show, and now the license that they had to use it for broadcast is not the license for streaming or the DVDs. So it's a different song. That show starts with a different opening music. On other media. And I was flipping around. I was like, oh, Dawson's Creek. Because there's this really interesting episode like at the beginning of like the second season where he's making a movie that's basically like Dawson's Creek. It gets really meta. And Rachel Lee Cook, she guest stars as like one of the girls in their class, and she's playing the role that of Joey, the main girl character in the thing, but in the movie. And there's this jealousy, and it's all like typical, the same teenage drama shit. But I tried to watch that episode. I couldn't get past the fact that the opening didn't match. It was like, I need to go find this song on Spotify just to play it while the show starts, because I can't get over the fact that it's
I never really watched that
screwy
show,
weird.
but I know I just to know enough from the zeitgeist to follow.
Yeah, I watched like the first 2.5 seasons, and I don't have a huge desire to go back.
Now I did watch plenty of Beverly Hills 90210 and the one that was on after it, but
Melrose Place.
Melrose Place,
yeah. So I'm interested. I'm wondering, like, if you watch 90210, that episode that has the Goo Goo Dolls in it, that like made the Goo Goo Dolls a household name, the song "Name," where they're playing in the club that the kids go to, did they have to cut that scene? Is that an episode they can't show? Like, or is that song in there? And how does that all work? That's interesting to me. I'm looking at the information about the soundtrack to Queen of the Damned, and so in the book Queen of the Damned, Lestat the vampire wakes up because a band is playing in the house above where he's hiding in the basement or whatever. So he comes up and he starts playing violin with them and singing with them and stuff. And so then they quit the band that they're in and they become his band. And so they got Jonathan Davis from Korn to write all the songs that Lestat's band plays. And of course, nu metal was like at the high. It was basically about to enter its downward turn in some ways in 2002 when that film comes out. And the problem was they could get Jonathan Davis to write all the music, but he couldn't record any of the songs because he was licensed under a competing company for his audio vocal performances. So they got all these artists who could. So like Wayne Static and David Draymond from Disturbed and Chester from Linkin Park and Marilyn Manson and then Jay Gordon of Orgy. They sing all these songs. So, again, this comes back to that, hey, all these are written for this movie, but then there's a bunch of other songs that weren't written for the movie that are on there, like Penetrate by Godhead and Down with the Sickness by Disturbed, and the Deftones song Changing the House of Flies, that's on Around the Fur, I think. or somewhere around there. There's a Kidney Thief song on there. So that's an interesting, like, half and half kind of situation of that whole composition and curation kind of move on soundtracks. And I guess, your example of the Trolls soundtrack is kind of like that too. Like, if you listen to it on one of the streaming services, the versions that are on the streaming soundtrack, and I'm guessing also on the CD version, are often studio versions that weren't the ones used in the film. And part of it is that the film places all the songs in the context of the story. So sometimes you don't need the whole song. And sometimes the song needs to be a duet or have a chorus singing behind, whoever the main singer is. And that doesn't have to be the one that's on the soundtrack. Some similar things happen on Pitch Perfect as well. Some of the versions on the soundtrack album are pretty different from what ended up in the film. So,
well, it's interesting. Yeah. I don't know. It was just making me think of also where you have the sort of, maybe this isn't exactly in the same realm of what we're talking about, and I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, isn't there is it in the Batman? There's like some weird alternate version of Something in the Way by Nirvana, or they take a song and it's got parts of, it's kind of a remix, or it is a remix, but it's the song, but that would be sort of a subtext of soundtracks where, I noticed that a lot in different series we're watching on Netflix or something, where they're taking, I recognize that, and it's actually just maybe the rhythm guitar and some other parts of a actual song kind of merged as background. They're using it as in a totally different kind of context, but it is, I believe that, a lot of times it's stems from the song or some remix of the song or something.
It's like a remix. Yeah, exactly. That those
which is different than what we're talking about, but it's still tied to, I think it made me think of it because of the context of, there is something to the filmmaking where you can't just hit play and just play however it was recorded and necessarily have that work of how the scene is going. And, you have to actually, or a lot of times there'll be a song and they jump from halfway through the verse to the chorus, and unless you know the song, you don't really notice it. Right. It's in the background, but it's actually crafted around what's going on in the scene. I always found that kind of stuff kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because all these soundtracks, they're never playing the whole song in the movie anyway. But a lot of times it's a weird chopped up bits and pieces of a song, and then it ends up on the soundtrack. Because I think even actually probably more so back then with the CDs, and you might get the soundtrack before you saw the movie, and you're kind of looking out for when that song plays, and then you hear weird parts of it, or it's buried in the background, or it's not really the song same,
doesn't. Yeah, absolutely. The version that ends up on the disc is not the same at all.
It's not. It's not like when Gristlegraph was in that movie that we made at my senior year. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
That was literally just playing in the background as is.
Yeah.
That was,
Yeah.
Sorry, another
or
call
Pim and Baby Missing.
No one, right?
in that thing where I play all the parts except one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I looked up that Nirvana remix, and it's by a guy from Downers Grove, Illinois, which is where my friend Emmett lives, and it's this guy Illenium, who that's the DJ name of Nicholas D. Miller, and he took Something in the Way and rethought it, and it ended up in the Batman. So that's pretty interesting. Well, okay, so there's Barbie the album just came out.
Yeah.
Right? And nominated for several Grammys, Oscars, several Oscars, and won at least one. And Mark Ronson, who is a pretty big deal British pop and techno-y kind of producer, he wrote he wrote the Ken song that they had Ryan Gosling sing.
Yeah.
But I think the Billie Eilish song that's in that movie, let's see, where's the track list here? But
yeah, I just pulled it up. It's
Holy crap. There's a BarbieTheAlbum.com. And you can listen and buy vinyl versions, and there's all kinds of crazy splatter blue and pink stuff. There's a transparent pink cassette and an ocean blue opaque cassette of the Barbie album. It's crazy. Where did you pull up that?
I just literally Spotify? Googled it, so I'm like, let me see where the.
So on that, you got Lizzo, Dua Lipa, Nicki Minaj, Ice Spice and Aqua, Sam Smith, Billie Eilish.
Isn't there? I guess I don't see it here now. Where is the?
There's all kinds of people on this thing.
Because isn't there like a cover of? It's not Nickelback, is it? It's whatchamacallit? It was in the movie.
In the Barbie movie?
Yeah. Did you see that movie?
No, I haven't watched it yet.
Oh, it's really good.
I've been meaning to, but I've heard good things. I was going to watch it the other day, and then we thought, well, this isn't a movie we necessarily want to watch with the 8-year-old.
Yeah. I guess I can't really think of anything that jumps out as. I mean, I don't know. It's got all kinds of meanings woven in that different. We don't go down the wormhole of debating the Barbie movie, I think, right now. But what is the song I'm thinking of, though? It's I wanna push you around, and what is that song?
Yeah, I want to take you for granted. No, that's not Stained. Oh God,
because it's in the movie, and there's a version of it I thought was on the soundtrack, but I don't see it. That's kind of hilarious, just the way they.
It's Matchbox 20. And it's called Push.
Yeah, I guess it's not on the soundtrack, but I remember.
But Ryan Gosling sings it.
Right, and it's pretty hilarious.
But it's not on the soundtrack. Yeah, it's
I
not
don't
on
see
Barbie's
it, but
album.
I remember hearing it. So I hadn't seen the movie, and I was visiting Bella, and she was playing. I thought the soundtrack on Spotify, but I actually don't see that unless it used to be there and disappeared for some reason.
So that's interesting. I'm Just Ken is on Barbie the Album.
Okay, so it's on Barbie the Album Best Weekend Ever edition.
Okay. Yeah. So so that's another one of those things to like talk about when like a soundtrack does well, so they release another one. So there's the second, like volume 2, volume 3, whatever. That happened apparently a lot with those kind of those biker movies where they could sort of mine that. So even 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they were doing the same thing with selling records to teenagers who were into movies. Yeah. You make 100 versions of the same movie over and over, and then you also put out 2 or 3 records of the soundtrack music.
So that just made me think of that idea of the second album that's still technically supposed to be a soundtrack, and this is like the genre of music's a little different than we're talking about. It was the same time period, like the mid 90s. So Trainspotting.
Yeah,
that was a huge soundtrack.
That was a huge soundtrack. That one was massive.
Second
and great
album
too.
Came out.
Yeah.
But it was supposedly a soundtrack for I can't even find the second one. Because then there eventually, way later, was a second movie. But there were 2 soundtracks.
2 decades later. There was like that Trainspotting 2 came out in what, 2019 or something?
Something like that,
2020.
But I remember Trainspotting because I had that CD, and then at some point, shortly, like kind of to what you're saying, it got some traction, and so there was a second soundtrack album. Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent soundtrack. There's so many great songs on the Trainspotting soundtrack, and it's so very like Brit kind of club scene kind of stuff, and stuff I never would have listened to if I hadn't picked up the soundtrack. But I just fell in love with the way that soundtrack was put together.
Am I right? Now I can't find any reference to. Oh wait, Trainspotting soundtrack 2. No, that's still. Oh yeah, Trainspotting number 2 from the motion picture, but it's not for the movie Trainspotting 2. It's from the first Trainspotting. But
music from the motion picture volume 2. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was like, For a second, I was like, did that really happen? But yeah. Although I don't see a track listing anywhere. But it was like, those songs were not really at all featured in that. I don't even know if they were in the movie or whatever. You know, it was like, it was more just trying to carry the wave of this type of songs on that first one.
Yeah, so I found it on Amazon, and so it still has Choose Life, which is also on the first one, but I wonder if it's a different version. But then it's got like Iggy Pop doing The Passenger and like David Bowie
so it's
song.
Like a couple remixes and
yeah,
it's the same vibe, but
yeah,
it was,
absolutely. Primal Scream,
definitely...
Joy Division, Goldie, Underworld, another Iggy Pop tune, but a remix of it. Heaven 17, Left Field. Yeah, I mean it's the same kind of vibe that's on that first soundtrack. That first soundtrack is just so excellent. You know, because again, it kicks off with Lust for Life, you know, New Order and Blur, Lou Reed, Underworld doing Born Slippy, some Damon Albarn stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of great stuff going on there. Another soundtrack then that is more along the lines of what we were talking about with like John Hughes and maybe some of those 70s directors putting songs they like is the Pulp Fiction soundtrack.
Okay.
Which is a crazy kind of conglomeration of stuff that Tarantino just liked. But, you know, it's got surf rock all through it.
Yeah.
It's got a bunch of 70s stuff like Jungle Boogie.
Yeah.
Neil Diamond's in there.
Al Green, Dusty Springfield.
Yeah. The Statler brothers doing Flowers on the Wall. But like that's another one of those things where I just put that on and play it, you know. Right. Son of a Preacher Man. I never knew how much I would have loved that song, but I love that song now because of the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. And it's very much like Quentin Tarantino made me a mixtape. That's totally what that soundtrack feels like. I've never looked at it, but the Reservoir Dogs soundtrack has all that.
Yeah. Does it have similar?
Yeah. It's so it's got that K. Billy Sounds of the 70s kind of thing where Stephen Wright is the DJ on the radio every time they're in the car or while they're waiting for everybody to show up. And then, you know, Hooked on a Feeling's in there. Magic Carpet Ride. Stuck in the Middle with You is used in that horrendous scene with the cop tied to the chair. That Harry Nilsson Put the Lime in the Coconut song.
Yeah.
And then he also cuts, well, whoever put the actual recorded soundtrack, you know, the album together, cut sequences from the film, like little vignette sort of pieces in between each of the songs.
So that, when you started talking about that, like the Tarantino soundtracks, that made me think of kind of like coming full circle, or maybe the meta soundtrack album would be the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack, which literally it's a plot point.
Yes.
Like the soundtrack is part of the plot.
The one and only last thing that ties him to his mother and to Earth, and that somehow survives all that weird alien technology and violence and everything. And
but like that's a cool idea, like, you know.
It is absolutely. And then but there's like a volume 2 of that.
Yeah.
Like, and you could buy that on a cassette or vinyl. The vinyl of that is all over the place. Like, you can find it at like Walmart and Target and, you know, all kinds of places like that too. But that soundtrack, and on vinyl in particular, with the sort of resurgence of vinyl, is kind of interesting. Yeah, so I guess this hasn't gone away, but it's become differently niche.
Yeah.
In some ways, and again, it's this whole kind of, I think it was a moment, honestly, where multimedia didn't know how to be multimedia all on the web yet. The internet and the web was still a little too new up through the mid-aughts.
Right.
So in the 90s, they could really just pump that money cow, for all it was worth. And then things changed. And so now it's this different sort of curated thing.
Right.
Because, yeah, like you said, the plot point in Guardians of the Galaxy is that is a mixtape. It's his mom's collection of the best songs she's ever heard that, here you go, kid. You should listen to all this. This is what you need to understand what's good about music.
Yeah.
And again, Blue Sweet shows up one more time with Hooked on a Feeling.
Yeah. Well, there's something to that, like the fact that that's on those. There's definitely something to, especially even more now, and kind of a little bit to what I was alluding to before, where there's songs that are now kind of in the culture that they themselves help feed a mood of a scene in such a way that you can't, like, just by having that particular song changes the tone of a scene or what's happening. Like, there's certain songs that are super powerful, whereas I don't know that would be the same in a 70s movie or an 80s, like, maybe it would, but I don't know.
Well, okay, so yeah, this is one of those things where when I was looking up the stuff about all the biker movies, and one of the the culmination, it's not the first movie to do this kind of thing with the soundtrack, but it's one of the best knowns and is absolutely part of the sort of cultural knowledge, is Easy Rider. And so the soundtrack to Easy Rider starts off with The Pusher by Steppenwolf.
Okay.
And then Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf. And then there's another song, and then a song by the Byrds, and then a couple more songs, and then Jimi Hendrix.
But what I'm saying is, like, so at the time Easy Rider came out, Born to Be Wild didn't have that same sense of, because Born to Be Wild was a big thing tied to bikers. Now, if you played Born to Be Wild in a scene in a movie that came out now, it would have an impact based on culture. That's what I'm saying. Like, more and more, like, some of these classic rock songs or indie rock, whatever the genre is, doesn't matter. But if it's tied to something culturally, that it adds that extra layer to a movie scene. So I think that's actually a perfect example, because I think if you were in 1973, or I don't know when the hell Easy Rider came out.
69.
Okay, I was off by a little bit, but
it's all good.
Born to Be Wild coming on is just a song that is in a tone, but at that point in time, it doesn't carry any weight, because the weight that it has is partly from, because you instantly think of biker movie scenes, but it's because it was in that movie, or probably because it was in that movie. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know if there was a similar example to movies in the 70s that were pulling, maybe there was some 40s song or something that had some kind of weight that carried a scene and gave it a certain tone, and I'm just not, aware of it being of a different generation. But does that make sense? Like,
yeah, no, I get it. Yeah. By playing these songs that are nostalgic and older, you're evoking, the song itself evokes something that is a shorthand to set
it could be anything. I mean,
mood.
if you're watching a comedy or you're watching some movie and it's some song from The Sound of Music comes on, it's lending some tone and something. It means something to why it's playing into the scene.
If anybody put yakety sax on something, which I've actually seen in some sort of comedic TikTok kind of things, it very clearly brings me back to Benny Hill.
Right.
And right. Okay, so here's one that I don't know if you've ever paid much attention to it, but it's one of those soundtracks that I think in any discussion like this sort of needs to be mentioned, and it's The Big Chill. So the Big Chill soundtrack starts off with I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye, then goes to My Girl by the Temptations, Good Lovin' by the Young Rascals, Tracks of My Tears by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Joy to the World by Three Dog Night, Ain't Too Proud to Beg by the Temptations, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman by Aretha Franklin, I Second That Emotion by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Whiter Shade of Pale, Procol Harum, and then Tell Him by the Exciters. And then goes on to add a couple other songs from the same era. But so all of these songs are from between 63 and 71, which is when the film is set.
Right.
But it was made in 83. So it's cashing in on that soul and R&B stuff because it's this group of baby boomers who get together 15 years after, they were friends.
Right.
Because of the
so
death
I wonder,
of their buddy.
I wonder if actually that's a good example of maybe I'm just kind of conflating. So if I know I maybe saw The Big Chill once, but I don't even remember if I did. I saw it 20 or 30 years ago. Like if I watch that now, would the music, the impact of music that came out before I was born in a movie, to me is going to, like you said, convey like the time period or stuff, but it's not going to maybe necessarily carry that same weight. But to the generation that movie was actually targeted at, that were of that time and of that age, it will carry much more weight, much in the same way as if we watch a movie about the 90s and a bunch of these songs that we listened to in 92 pop in, it's going to mean something more to us than just someone who was born in, 2010. It's just that, that's old music from the 90s, but it doesn't otherwise carry any.
Right. Yeah, there's, it's a big thing to like make movies 20 or 30 years after a time period and then sell them to the adults that lived through that time period. That's a pretty common move. It's the way fiction works, the way storytelling works, it's the way nostalgia in our culture works. But yeah, like, you put a bunch of, there was that musical, now like 10 or 12 years ago that was based on all the hair metal. And like
Rock of Ages, is that?
Yeah, I think that's what it was called. It had oh my god,
Mark
Tom
Wahlberg.
Cruise played.
Yeah,
he played a character that was sort of.
Yeah, and it was all based like, I think Def Leppard-y, Judas Priest kind of stuff.
Yeah, and Guns N' Roses and all that kind of thing. Tom Cruise plays a guy named Stacy Jax, and Stacy is spelled Stacee, and Jax is spelled Jaxx. And
was Mark Wahlberg in that, or am I mixing that with the different? Or is that?
Oh no, that's
that other movie where
that's
it's
the other one.
The Judas Priest story, kind of ish.
Yeah. No, Rock of Ages is very much like a stage musical using all of the hair metal songs from the 80s, and interestingly, co-written by Justin Theroux, who would have been just the right age at that time. It's interesting. The cast is weird because like Catherine Zeta-Jones and Paul Giamatti and Bryan Cranston and Alec Baldwin are all in it, but they're sort of like the old crusty like parents and like producers and managers and stuff, and then like Russell Brand and weirdly Tom Cruise, though, who's as old or older than those other cats, is like the big rock star dude. They're all waiting to show up. Yeah. Oh man, what is that Mark Wahlberg movie called?
I saw it within the last couple of years, but
Rockstar.
Okay.
Yeah. So Rockstar came out in 2001, and that.
But that's loosely based on the true story of the guy that came in and replaced Rob Halford for a little bit, I think, in Judas Priest.
Huh. That's interesting.
Because I think he was from here, I think he was from Northeast Ohio.
Okay. Because, this is like about a guy who ascends to the position of lead vocalist, even though he was originally in a cover band.
Yeah.
He becomes the... Yeah. So it was inspired by the real life story of Tim Ripper Owens, right? He replaced Rob Halford. That's so interesting.
So another, I don't know.
And he's from Akron, yeah.
Yeah, I knew it was from, which is probably why I know a little more about it than just, I'm not a huge fan of the movie. And just but so another kind of bit of soundtracks that maybe Actually, it's not. It wouldn't be as popular as some of the like The Crow and all those kind of things in terms of what we were talking about at the very beginning, but makes me think of. So you got like Lost Highway and like kind of any David Lynch soundtrack kind of stuff, which those artists are in a same or similar area, but I feel like that's actually a very different than like The Crow or whatever in terms of like I don't know. Or David Lynch has his own sort of curated.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because like he always has Angelo Badalamenti do, he always was working with Badalamenti for scores and stuff, Twin Peaks, whatever else. And Badalamenti's all over that soundtrack. But the interesting thing, I saw a documentary about David Lynch, and like he only puts music that he likes in his movies.
Yeah.
And so he hires Trent Reznor to produce that. And then Reznor, does some stuff as himself, but also there's some Nine Inch Nails, and then there's a Smashing Pumpkins tune. Lou Reed covering This Magic Moment. Marilyn Manson has a couple of songs on there. That's the first time I'd ever heard of Rammstein.
Okay.
I'd never heard anything else, but the Rammstein song is like that. The song that's, the name of the band is so prominently in that one part. And then David Bowie's in there.
Bowie and
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like that there's a very particular flavor to that soundtrack or his soundtracks that even though there's that crossover, you named artists that are on these other ones we talked about, but those soundtracks have a very different vibe.
Yeah. Well, so that's one of those things where like Trent Reznor's move into soundtrack production starts off basically with Trent Reznor making mixtapes. Trent Reznor curating a soundtrack. So like Natural Born Killers soundtrack is another one he put together. And it's interesting because Burn by Nine Inch Nails.
Not Burned by The Cure on the
right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's exactly the point I was thinking of. Is like the song Burned by The Cure is on The Crow, but here's a song called Burned by Nine Inch Nails. But there's like all these remixy kind of mashup things happening. Sex is Violent is a mashup of Ted Just Admit It by Jane's Addiction and I Put a Spell on You covered by Diamanda Gallas, which is a crazy juxtaposition of those two things, but it's super cool. And there's a bunch of cool stuff like that on this soundtrack. And that's the first one. That's 94. And that's the first soundtrack that Reznor does. Then he does Lost Highway. Then he does The Social Network.
Yeah. Is that the first with Atticus Ross?
Yeah, that's him and Atticus Ross, and that's them composing all the music. That's, there's the big transition, and that's 2010. So, 94, 97, and then a whole 13 years later,
right?
2010, he's working with Atticus Ross, and they do Social Network. Pretty different. And then the very next year, Reznor and Ross do the soundtrack or the score effectively for Girl with a Dragon Tattoo.
Yeah.
And there's like disc upon disc there's so many tracks from that. So that's a pretty different approach there. I'm glad you mentioned Guardians of the Galaxy and Trolls, even though those movies are now 10 years old, which is sobering. You're close to it,
Yeah.
Like, those are albums like 2015, 2016, somewhere in there, something like that. But I don't know of soundtracks other than now this Barbie thing, which kind of fits, and it's got that kind of musical vibe to it. The Pitch Perfect is a cappella and mashups. Yeah. They rarely sing just one song throughout probably half that soundtrack. There are multiple volumes of that soundtrack too, but again, that's what 2000 13 or something, maybe 2012. And so I can't think of a soundtrack other than like this Barbie one just recently that I know of for its quirky, interesting, curated collection of songs.
Right.
Probably not for at least 5 and maybe almost 10 years.
Although I wonder how you would even look into that. Because again, going back to your point, it's not being hyped, and it may have been released as an album, but maybe not really. Or, I think the Barbie's a good example because as part of marketing extra stuff for that movie to put, and now we're kind of in the sort of vinyl resurgence and some of that physical media. Whereas, the gap between 10 years ago and now, there's a whole chunk of time where there was no reason to, stick some physical media. Or maybe there was like a DVD version of a movie that also had a soundtrack CD in it for some reason or something, or whatever. Like, I don't know. Like,
yeah.
I don't even know how you would go about looking at it. I mean, I guess you could just Google, like, show me every soundtrack for the last.
Yeah, or look at popular films. But this is almost something like why this comes up in my mind, because I remember so often sitting through credits in the 90s and early aughts and whatever, and watching the whole list of all of the licensed songs, scroll past you. And now I don't see that often, unless it's like these diegetic bits of like this song shows up here or there, but it's like one or two like well-known artists or well-known songs or something. But it's not like a list that just goes on and on and on of pop music, except for stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
The Thor movie. Oh, that's a good one. That's one to think about because, they finally got around to using that Led Zeppelin Hammer of the Gods. Isn't that the name of that song?
That was the name of the book about them. I think it's a lyric. But there's no song called Hammer of the Gods.
What's the song Come from the Land of the Ice and Snow?
Immigrant Song.
That's Immigrant Song. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lyric in Immigrant Song.
Hammer of the Gods. And there was a book about them called Hammer of the Gods, but there was
Okay. So the Thor Ragnarok. Okay. So this is an interesting thing that I think comes up with talking about Reznor doing scores and that sort of thing. The score to this film is composed by Mark Mothersbaugh, who's from Devo. And that dude's been making music for movies and TV for a long, long time. But he's not going out and grabbing a bunch of cool stuff that he likes. He's, composing music as a composer. And then he also, this says he was influenced by the work of Jean-Michel Jarre, that we talked about him way back in an earlier episode. Oh, in a Skinny Puppy episode, we talked about him a little bit.
Yeah.
And so this is all done on synthesizers and influenced by his work. But that's an interesting sort of move.
So where I thought you were going was, so you mentioned the girl with the dragon tattoo and Reznor and Atticus Ross. They do Immigrant Song on that soundtrack.
Ah, okay.
So I thought you were bringing it around to that.
I hadn't put that together, but that's cool. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, so interesting thing, like after Mark Mothersbaugh did and I was looking at actually Thor Ragnarok. So the third Thor movie, not the fourth Thor movie, but the third one, Mothersbaugh does that. And then the very next film that he does the soundtrack score or whatever for is Hotel Transylvania 3. But on that, there's this whole collection where they got DJ Tiesto to put together a disco party kind of group of things. And then they had, so he did 3 tracks, and then There's a DNCE song and a Pitbull song, and one of the Jonas Brothers and Bruno Mars, because there's this whole dance party at the beach at the end of the movie.
So you're telling me Mr. Worldwide is on the soundtrack? Sorry.
Yeah, so weird. There's just such an odd.
I will freely admit I've seen 0 Hotel Transylvania movies,
dude,
and 0 Thor movies. But
oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I've never. I've seen maybe 20% of Marvel movies that have been released, if that.
I have not seen possibly 10% of them at most.
I want to watch. I'm actually at that point where I'm like, I want to watch them, but then I'm like, okay, so there's so many of them now that I got to go back and figure out, okay, what is the right order, or what should I watch?
Yeah. Just look it up, like what order you got to watch.
No, I know.
Yeah. Just look up some listing that somebody, and then decide if you want to see them actually chronologically, or if you want to see them the way they were released.
Yeah.
Because, you have to start with Captain America, and then you have to watch Captain Marvel or something, because,
which I've seen both those. But.
Oh, okay. Well, they're the earliest two in the narrative structure. Yeah. I think.
I'm definitely, I've not seen like the last 3 Avengers. I've only seen like one Iron Man. Now I know a lot of stuff, again, because I live and breathe on the earth, and so
Yeah. Well, and you live with a couple of teenagers too, right? So
no, I don't think any of them have.
Really?
No, I think it's more just I picked it up in the pop culture. Anyway. We're digressing. We're talking specifically about movies now and not soundtracks. So
yeah. Well, yeah. Mark Mothersbaugh is an interesting one. Trent Reznor's another interesting one. I mean, this is one of those things where I fully imagine some kid to say to me at some point, "Oh, the guy who did all the music for this movie was in this band called Devo." Yeah, he was. That's right. And I don't know, like. I know that I said some of that kind of stuff to my mom when I was younger. Oh, that director was in this movie? No way.
Yeah.
Stuff like Clint Eastwood and, well, just looking at the career of somebody like Kurt Russell and the fact that he was in a bunch of Disney movies in the 60s. And his dad was an actor too, and I'd never even heard of him. But yeah, so this whole thing with these soundtracks, I just keep wondering what it would take for something like that to happen again, where you get all these curated song things. And Barbie seems like a good example of what it would take. I mean, hype and marketing were a big part of that, a multimedia blitz, a sort of cultural touchstone moment.
Do you think, though, that the stuff that we started with, say The Crow, Spawn, or even Trainspotting, or some of these, like, we're talking about them like they were huge, but were they as huge? Whereas Barbie is 100% full-on mainstream, massive. I'm sure people know what Trainspotting is, but I don't know that. I know everybody.
I think Trainspotting. I think Trainspotting.
I bet I don't know if I asked my wife if she knows what that movie is, and she's only
that's interesting.
2 or 3 years younger. So that's what I mean. Like, I think they're definitely popular, but are they full blown? Or The Crow is probably a better example, because I don't even know if the hugeness of that soundtrack very much is also related to the time period and everything else that we were doing and going. You know what I mean? Like, I agree that it seems like it was huge, but I don't know that it was in the total pop culture. I mean, I don't know. Did it hit Billboard number? You know what I mean? Whereas like stuff off the Barbie soundtrack could be on the top of Billboard. I don't know that the Trainspotting soundtrack was hitting. You know what I mean? That's what I mean. Like,
yeah, okay, I follow what you're saying.
Yeah. I'm not saying that they weren't big, but were they big in certain subcultures and areas that maybe not?
I think that it seems to me like the success of the way the Crow soundtrack went probably set a pattern for, hey, you know what, we can milk this, and this is a ripe sort of subgenre spot that we haven't done enough with, but seems like it's on the rise. And some of the things about The Crow being like that was Lollapalooza was a thing. Yeah. Even if you didn't go to it, even if you didn't know most of the bands, you heard about the event, and it just kept growing and growing till it is what it is now. And then I think that set a pattern for the Crow sequel to have a similar kind of soundtrack. But then, all of those other films that are kind of looking at the same audience, probably likewise, pulling that kind of thing together. One thing we haven't really talked about is the way that rap has likewise sort of been tied to whole genres of film, from comedy stuff to things like Boys in the Hood, and even just like the ways in which rap musicians have become subject of films. Like there's the whole TV series about Wu-Tang Clan that was on one of the cable streamers. And there was the movie about NWA where Ice Cube's son played Ice Cube. And those soundtracks and scores are very clearly the music tied to those genres as well. We also didn't talk about The Wedding Singer.
This is true. We did not.
But that's a pretty great soundtrack too. If you're looking for like a good collection of new wave pop, like there's some really great tunes on that. But again, that's that filmmaker. Is that
the one with the total eclipse of the heart scene with the guys like swearing through the whole thing or whatever? Like I can't remember if that's that movie or.
I'm not sure. I know that like in the film, Adam Sandler tells his ex-girlfriend not to wear his Van Halen t-shirt because it'll make the band break up, and it's supposed to be like the year that David Lee Roth leaves and right before Sammy Hagar joins the band. And Billy Idol is on the airplane at the end of the film, telling him to go back and get that girl, and you love her.
So I was thinking of a scene in Old School, so never mind.
Oh, okay. All right, here's a crazy ass thing that I had no idea about. So I stumbled onto this accidentally over the weekend, and it's kind of tied to this. So there's this composer, and his name is Jim Steinman.
The Meatloaf guy.
The Meatloaf guy, exactly. So Jim Steinman, in the 60s, wrote a bunch of musical stage drama, bunch of musical plays in the late 60s and early 70s, and then ended up meeting up eventually with Meatloaf and writing Bat Out of Hell and Bat Out of Hell 2. Like, he wrote every single song on the album, wrote those albums, and Meatloaf is just his performer for his compositions. So there's a musical touring now, I believe. It's been around for a while, where it's called Bat Out of Hell, but it's Jim Steinman's Bat Out of Hell, and it's all the music from those albums with a musical review, but there's a narrative, I guess, mixed through it. Well, the interesting piece of that too, though, is that he wrote this musical in '69 called The Dream Engine, and pieces of Dream Engine show up in all these other songs he wrote. So, like, that Meatloaf song, you took the words right out of my mouth, where he makes this little speech about, I bet you say that to all the boys. At the end, like, the girl and the guy talk back and forth to each other. So, yeah. That's from this Dream Engine thing. But so is the Turnaround Bright Eyes lyric from Total Eclipse of the Heart, because he wrote that song too.
Oh, yeah.
And then he also wrote Making Love Out of Nothing at All that Air Supply did. And that's in this touring stage play now. Like, all these songs are interwoven through this Bat Out of Hell thing, which is just wacky. But this is somebody writing, I think, what to him is either theatrical or dramatic or narrative music.
Yeah.
in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and then, moving it into the 80s, which is why Total Eclipse of the Heart is such a weird ass video and everything else. Like, there's just so much strange stuff going on there. And that line, Turn Around Bright Eyes, is sung by Christopher Cross. And Christopher Cross is a weird one for movie soundtracks because he did the Arthur's theme, yeah. And also, I think he wrote some of the stuff. There's a song. There's this Billy Crystal and Gregory Hines movie where they end up like one of the songs from the movie is by the guy who was in the Doobie Brothers for a while.
Michael McDonald.
Yes, that's him. That's it. And
I know what movie you're talking about. I can't think of it.
Well, yes, because you probably saw the music video of them in that video with him. It's the Michael McDonald song from that movie, but Gregory Hines and Billy Crystal are in the video with him, and then there are all those cut clips out of the movie in there too.
Yeah,
I'm sure you saw that a zillion times.
No, I totally remember seeing that. I just can't think of that movie. Were they cops or were they dancers?
Yeah, and there's something where they end up on a boat.
Yeah, I don't remember.
But okay, so I guess we're a little far afield from where we started, but this whole idea of music videos as promotional materials for films, and so the one big song, maybe two by the same artist or something.
Yeah,
there's this movie that Mikhail Baryshnikov was in, White Nights.
Yep.
And I ended up getting that soundtrack because I thought some song was on there that wasn't. For whatever reason. There was some tune that I thought was on the White Nights soundtrack, and it was not. So I asked my parents for it for Christmas. And they got it for me weirdly, which, but the song that was huge from that was Separate Lives by Phil Collins and Marilyn Martin. Yeah, Phil Collins and Marilyn Martin did Separate Lives. That song was the big song from that soundtrack. But, I guess, that's 1985. So it's still around the time when John Hughes is putting all of his stuff together. This has a Lou Reed song and a Roberta Flack song and a Robert Plant song and Nile Rodgers and Chaka Khan.
So there was definitely, now that you're thinking of, like, for that time period, because that just made me think maybe that's the precursor to, we referenced a bunch of these ones in the 90s where it's like Metallica and Orbital or whatever, like in that sort of mix. And it's not the same, like it's not mixing genres to get together and do stuff, but you're referencing Phil Collins and somebody, because he did a couple soundtrack songs where there's some other female vocalist, but it's for a movie. You had the guy from Loverboy and Ann Wilson from Heart did the song.
Yeah.
Like, I think there was a decent chunk of those where there was like a male vocalist and a female vocalist from two separate bands. They're both like generally rock or pop, that a song is on a scar. I'm guessing, was there maybe something on the Top Gun soundtrack, or was that where the
Top Gun soundtrack had some. Top Gun soundtrack had.
That's actually, I think that's the one where it's what Mike Love and Ann Wilson. I think that's actually
right.
on
And the other big tune that came off of that was the "Take My Breath Away" from Berlin.
Yeah.
What else is on there? And "Danger Zone" by Kenny Loggins. And there's a Cheap Trick song and Miami Sound Machine and Heaven in Your Eyes just by Loverboy. And yeah, that's weird. Didn't even think about that. But I guess the mid 80s had a decent number of these kinds of things.
Well, I think because I think it comes back to where you were going a little bit, is because that's a music video heyday. Yes. So it's a different. Whereas I think we started off with The Crow and these other ones where it was like the CD was the piece to kind of get the money,
right,
and the extra whatever to tie to the movie. But the 80s, I think, was purely like music videos are what are selling music. How do we also get music videos to sell movies or vice versa? How does that all intertwine? And I think that's where you get, because there's a ton of music videos from the 80s that are from movies. And then there's like your Billy Crystal, Gregory Hines example, or there's a lot of cameos from,
right.
Which all that tells you is most likely while they were filming the movie, they were already building the soundtrack and getting these songs ready, and they pull somebody aside for a half a shooting day and stick them in a couple weird scenes in a music video that 9 times out of 10 made no sense why they were in there, and then splice in a few clips from the movie.
Yeah, like a lot of these music videos for the songs on these soundtracks, the ones that got the big push, were effectively trailers and promotional material for the band. So it's like, you've got Kenny Loggins, on a weirdly lit stage cut in with jet fighters,
right,
and stuff like that. And so again, like, now, okay, this kind of, maybe this is where we can bring it home and kind of bring it back full circle. So with the popularity of TikTok and YouTube and what have you, making video, and the fact that you're carrying, better than a TV in your pocket all the time, every day, how come there aren't more pushes like this to hype a film or whatever else? I wonder if
it's a good question. I mean, I still think a little bit of it is just ties into all these other conversations we've had, just music and like, it's not about a CD, so it might be about a song.
Right. You're not trying to sell copies of records. Yeah.
And so it may not be front of mind. Like, it's probably still a good marketing tactic in some capacity if you can connect a song that gets threaded through that TikTok culture or whatever.
Right.
That has a connection to something like going to a theater and seeing a movie. But it's probably a much trickier thing to navigate, and I don't know how you force it or. It goes back to the same thing. Like, in the 80s, people bought CDs or bought albums and went to movies, and those were the very traditional, straight forms of consuming media. Now you've got 9 ways to Sunday to kind of digest things, and there's no general thing that these type of people that look at these type of TikToks go to these type of movies or do these type of things. Like, you've got, it's all, I don't know how you would, it'd be more of a coincidence or, circumstantial coming together thing that may happen, I think, versus plan. I think all this stuff we've talked about before, there was definitely a wing of marketing and stuff behind it to make it go that way.
Okay, that's a really interesting thing, and I think you're onto a really good point about what was happening at those times for about, I don't know, 50 years or something, 60 years, that some of taste was dictated by marketing people. Marketing people told you what to like, and there were people who were sort of deputized by the music industry, the film industry, whatever, to go find a band, go find a song, go find a performer, and cultivate that, A&R people, right? And so they're going to go sign a new band because, hey, everybody's saying this band is awesome, you got to go check it out. Or have you heard this tune? You got to get this tune, get something going with this. So, this person, your singles aren't where it's at anymore, so get this person to record an album just so you can release this tune so it'll chart and you get radio play and whatever else. So there were people whose job it was explicitly to decide what would become popular. And the entire mechanism of the entertainment industry was built around making those things popular and trying to tap into what popularity was. And for the most part, they could kind of be assured that they were going to hit more often than they were going to miss. Because they knew what was going on and they had their fingers on the pulse. And that's where, like, underground music and weird little quirky things threw people for a loop every so often. Oh, why did the B-side go popular? Oh, this one radio station started playing that B-side. Some DJ in Phoenix starts playing Red Red Wine by UB40 years after it was released, and suddenly it's on the charts because of that in the late 80s there. And that wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. So there's little pieces like that are accidents, and then there's the stuff that's happening in the real underground kind of stuff where there's things that only people who are clued into certain things a certain way are going to catch what's going on. But otherwise, pop music was very formula driven or this cultivated thing that was being given to you. And now that's a hard sell. That's a hard thing to do. Korea tries to do it with K-pop, where like the entire music industry there is served by their TV industry. So they've got these competition every single week. Every K-pop girl group, boy group, whatever, performs their latest single in this competition, and then people vote, and then they rise to the top, and then they perform the song live, and then it happens again a week later, and like different idols host this show, and it's all this kind of self-gratifying thing. But like you were saying, it's so out there with data. Like, how much data can you actually pull when there's so many of these wide varieties of things that are appealing to such a wide variety of people? And then some people don't want to make their streaming number. Like Netflix didn't make their streaming numbers available. You couldn't tell how things were charting on Netflix until I think Europe forced them to or something. Like there's only recently been data coming out from some streamers about what is most popular, what is getting the most streaming. I'm sorry, it wasn't Europe. It had, I think it has to do with the writers, the strike, the actors strike, and the writers strike, and all that. I think one of the things that came out of that was, they have to have accurate numbers of streaming to let people know what's going on with the value of their art.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is a lot of data tied to anything you do. If you listen to anything on a streaming service, it's tied to all kinds of IDs and your IP address and the last 5 pages you surfed to before you went to that and whatever else. Yeah. Google definitely knows a ton of shit about you, and so does Facebook. But I think the aggregation of that is not for public consumption the same way. It's all focused around you. Like your feed of ads.
Yeah. You're seeing, I mean, your Netflix example is good too. Like you open up Netflix and you're seeing it's saying. I mean, there may be some accuracy to here's what's top 10 in the US, but we actually honestly don't know. I mean, I guess we could test it. If you open your Netflix and I open my Netflix at the same time and we get 3 other people, is that top 10 even actually the same? Or is it still somewhat based on my viewing taste versus your viewing taste? Yeah, and that's where I think where you're going is, so there's I don't even think the big companies, the big marketing arm, the big conglomerate they have to lean into that as the mechanism to then try to get something popular. It's not because you have 3 TV stations, a couple radio stations, and a movie theater down the corner, and those are your choices, and there's 5 choices in those things, and so they can do that nowadays. You have 1,000 choices here on every platform. You have 15 different platforms to choose. There's so much stuff. And we've talked about the benefits of some of those things and the data and all that stuff. But in this particular conversation, trying to understand why maybe soundtracks and that type of formula doesn't work anymore.
Right.
It would still be cool if they did that, but I think it wouldn't be a money-making thing. It would be because somebody thought it was cool to get these bands together. Right. Like that would be the only reason that would happen now.
Yeah, I think because I think there's like the surprise accidental success of the Quentin Tarantino stuff, like the Reservoir Dogs and in particular the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. I don't think they thought that Pulp Fiction soundtrack was going to do what it did, but people started requesting songs, or calling up radio stations to ask, what's the name of this, and can you play it, and who did it, or whatever. That was an accident. But a lot of the rest of this stuff was not an accident. It was very intentional, as far as the success. And now they have the ability to just come straight to you, but they can sell a ton of shit just to you, and they might not sell all the same stuff to me. But enough of it's going to overlap that they can find us in our little niches and then point us in a certain direction. And some of that's algorithmic, and some of it is just the nature of this data mining that the internet is built on.
Yeah. And I think there's money to be had elsewhere of that type of, which you might call residual money or something. So again, kind of, if the premise in some ways was the soundtrack is now an extra revenue stream tied to this movie, I think a lot of it is now also flipped. What popped in my head was Squid Games or something.
Yeah, okay.
That magically becomes popular, and then there's okay, well, let's sell the masks and do the thing and try a reality show around it, or do maybe that's not a great example, but it feels like all those sort of add-ons are after there's some established level of popularity.
Right.
Because you almost, partially because you just can't take a chance on it. You're not going to spend all this money on something and then it doesn't get popular. Now you've got all this merchandise and all this other stuff.
Right.
Whereas I think before
Yeah.
you could kind of predict to some degree. You had the right star in the project, or because now you could have, you get the biggest star in something, and I mean probably outside of Taylor Swift and a couple other people, it doesn't guarantee that that's gonna rake in the dough, and you should print all the shirts and make the toys and do all the
right. And the other piece of that is you can set up the mechanism to have shirts printed without having to print 10,000 shirts.
True. Yeah.
And not sell all the extra smalls and extra larges. You can set it up. Yeah, that whole notion of whatever on demand, anything on demand is significant. So you can do a limited run that you'll sell out of. And then if you need more, you can decide what you want to do with that, or, hand it off. And you got people doing your marketing for you on Redbubble and any of the rest of that. So I guess, to bring this home and to close us out, I've just been struck by the fact that I remember soundtracks with multiple artists in the 80s and 90s being such a bigger deal than they appear to be now. And some of it is very clearly marketing. Some of it is changes in media. And some of it is something I can't quite get my head around. And I keep wondering if there's some way that might come back or be different. I think video games might do some of it.
Maybe,
There's a Korean game called League of Legends. And League of Legends, being from Korea, has partnered with some K-pop artists and some Western artists as well. And at their world championship every year for that game, because that game is hugely massive, competitive esports, they have a live concert with a song or 5 songs or 10 songs that were written about League of Legends performed by all these artists. And some of those have become huge. Oh my gosh, Glitch Mob did one of them that my kid loves. There's a song called Rise that the Glitch Mob did with as a collaboration with a singer. And it's fantastic, and the music video is cool, and there's an animated TV series based on League of Legends on Netflix that arose from these music videos, because this French animation studio did all these music videos for all these songs based on this video game. And then they were hired by the video game company to turn that into a narrative based on the game. And that's an interesting sort of, here we've composed these songs, we've gotten this collection of artists together. There's a bunch of hip hop, there's a bunch of moody electro, almost industrial or almost metally kind of stuff for some of the stuff. You know, it's a really interesting collection of stuff. So anybody who's interested in K-pop or kind of alternative hip hop or anything like that should definitely check out Rise by the Glitch Mob. There's a whole like girl group, K-pop idol group called KDA, which is Kill Death Assists, you know, from a video game shooter thing. But KDA has as the singers 4 of the characters from the game, but it's really 2 K-pop stars and 2 American singers doing a bunch of tunes together. Some great music, really. Some really, really interesting stuff.
Is that, though, not trying to sound like I don't know. Is that still, though, the opposite of, if the video game is representing what the movie represented in the 80s, is this still, these are all after the fact things versus these?
They're actually promoting the
video game.
They're promoting the video game, but they don't actually appear in the games, I don't believe. That's true. That's true.
Which maybe that, so if the quest at the end is what changed, or why is this not a thing anymore, or what changed, I still think it comes down to even like that example. I think going forward, it's going to be hard to do something like a soundtrack, a collection of songs to then boost a thing. I think it's going to be the reverse. The thing is going to gain some kind of traction, and it will spawn, no pun intended, you know, some collection of, which would still be cool, I guess, if there was something, and then out of that, like some pretty cool music was collected or compiled. But even then, I think there was still something to the nature of this was delivered on a CD, where that probably wouldn't happen.
Right.
Now.
Yeah. That's,
and, you know, I mean, there's all those. I think there's just so many things that might be one of those. The specificity, I think, of what we started talking about at the very beginning might be just lost to time or culture, or the way that the world works. Like,
it could come back around if in nostalgia films.
Yeah,
you know, films
and it could,
about
or vinyl
the 90s.
Could be, you know, where like something got so popular and the vinyl got popular that was tied to the thing. I mean, so I don't want to say that it's like,
but it's I think the media, like I've got this thing in my hand that is all the coolest and most important songs from that film or project or whatever is not so likely. It's a playlist now.
Yeah.
Yeah, which you can't sell. Really,
and it doesn't. I mean, you can listen to it, but it doesn't still even hold. Although, you know, this whole thing has made me think of, like, I think probably tomorrow I'll listen to a few of these soundtracks that I haven't listened to in quite a while. But
agreed. Yeah, me too. Well, I don't know if we solved anything.
I don't know that was the ultimate goal.
It's not that we needed to, but it's still something that, you know, I'm you know, if we do get any kind of participation from anybody listening, and you're like, hey, dummies, look at this movie, this movie. I'd love to see that. Because I want to, especially if they're from like the last 3 to 5 years.
And that's where I wondered if there are these things that are popular that are just outside of, you know, we talked earlier about the Grammy list and realizing that I don't know any of the artists on there, so they could all be on a soundtrack.
A handful of them, but like, you know, I had no idea that Miley Cyrus had a new album, and that 2 or 3 of the songs would be up for Grammys from said album. Just no clue whatsoever. Yeah, so I think that, you know, if somebody's like, hey, and the way we watch films was totally jacked up by the pandemic. So maybe some of it is too, like, I'm not even thinking about the music as I hear it when I'm watching a movie in my house. How many movies have I watched with my phone on as I scroll through crap or whatever while the film is is on how many times have I turned off the credits, or they've become a tiny little box in the corner that I can't read unless I figure out what this streaming service's, relationship is with the remote
then you've
control.
even got how many movies are straight to streaming,
right.
They're not even getting a theatrical release, and they're not
right.
So you wouldn't have the machine behind it to also push a soundtrack or push.
Yeah, and what happens to licensing for streaming films on streaming services versus, being in a theater, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that have changed. There's a lot that's different, but it's good. I think it's good to just remember some of these soundtracks too, because like you said, some of them are really good. There's some really cool things. It's a neat mix. Somebody has curated this thing, whether it's the director of the film or some producer, like film producer, or it's just like somebody who's hired to put this collection of stuff together, and the way that it plays out is part of the narrative and evokes pieces of the film. It's nice to remember that and revisit it when you can. All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. And this is our third dip back into audio only. Stuff will still be available on YouTube. We're looking into distributing podcasts to other podcast platforms as well. If you want to catch up with us, we have a website, exit181.chaosspirals.com. You can also find us on Facebook. We have an Exit 181 Facebook page that you can interact with us on. Again, like we said, this will be on YouTube as well, and you can interact with us there. And we hope that you, if you do go to YouTube, please like and subscribe and click on the bell. Please follow us on your podcast app, particularly on Spotify. If you're looking to listen to us and we're still only on Spotify, let other people know that they can just listen to the podcast without the musical interludes on our website. There's a player that'll just skip all the songs that we intersplice throughout our conversations. Thanks for giving us your time and your interest and your attention, and any feedback you can provide, we'd love to hear from you. So once again, I'm Matt Duncan.
I'm Dean Bianchi.
And we will catch you next time on Exit 181.